You see, in every job that must be done, there is an element of fun.
Doe, a deer, a female deer, Ray.
Hear me calling. You'd be better off alone if I'm not who you.
He heard her voice again one night, not singing, just speaking. And for a moment, Steve Perry froze because the silence behind her words sounded terrifyingly familiar. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. Steve Perry didn't talk about it publicly, not then, not later, but something about her quietness unsettled him in a way most people never noticed. Julie Andrews was still everywhere. Interviews, award shows, smiles. But something essential had vanished, and Steve could hear it even when others couldn't. Because silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means survival, and Steve Perry knew exactly what that kind of silence cost. He had spent his life being told his voice was the thing, the gift, the reason. People didn't just listen to Journey, they felt him. That soaring sound didn't just hit notes, it carried emotion, desperation, release. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And what changed wasn't obvious at first. That was the most dangerous part. Steve noticed it before anyone else said a word. The way certain notes stopped feeling safe, the way power suddenly came with fear, the way his voice didn't always come back the same the next morning. And quietly, a thought crept in that terrified him. What if this doesn't fix itself? He didn't say it out loud, he didn't warn the fans, and he didn't explain himself to the band, because once you admit that thought, it becomes real. Julie Andrews had lived that moment already, but the world didn't see it happen. They only noticed afterward. People expected her to sing forever. They expected the sound they grew up with. But suddenly, she wasn't doing that anymore. She smiled, she spoke kindly, she showed up, but she didn't sing. And what bothered Steve wasn't the absence of music. It was the discipline of it, the restraint, the choice. Because silence like that isn't weakness. It's a decision made after something goes terribly wrong. Steve understood that decision, instinctively, even before he admitted it to himself. What most people don't understand is this. A damaged voice doesn't disappear overnight. It fades unevenly, unpredictably. One day it's there, the next day it betrays you. And every time you open your mouth, you wonder if this is the moment you lose it for good. Steve was living inside that fear, quietly. People later asked why he didn't push through, why he didn't just adjust, why he didn't become a softer version of himself. But that question misses the point, because for singers like Steve Perry, compromise isn't neutral. It feels like erasure. Julie Andrews knew this too. They weren't afraid of criticism. They were afraid of being remembered wrong. There's an unspoken rule among elite vocalists. Once the instrument is compromised, you don't pretend it isn't. You don't chase nostalgia. You don't ask the audience to lower their expectations. You protect what once existed, even if that means stepping away. Julie Andrews followed that rule without ever announcing it. Steve Perry felt himself approaching the same cliff, and what happened next terrified him more than losing fame ever could. There was a performance where Steve finished singing and didn't feel relief, only exhaustion. That was new. The joy didn't return the way it used to. Instead, there was calculation, control, fear disguised as professionalism, and suddenly, singing felt less like freedom and more like risk. Julie Andrews had felt that exact shift. She just reached it sooner. No one tells you this part. When a voice begins to fail, people don't notice at first. They compliment you anyway. They clap anyway. But you know, and that knowledge isolates you. Steve began pulling away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. There were conversations he never shared, fears he never voiced, because explaining vocal damage feels like admitting defeat before the battle is officially over. Julie Andrews didn't explain either. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't demand sympathy. She simply stopped. And that quiet dignity haunted Steve. By the time Steve Perry finally stepped back, people were confused. Some were angry. Some felt abandoned. But Steve wasn't thinking about crowds. He was thinking about something far more fragile, the memory of a voice that once felt infinite, and whether silence might be the only way to keep it intact. But there was still something he hadn't fully admitted yet, something even darker, something Julie Andrews understood long before anyone else did, and it wasn't about singing at all. Steve Perry didn't fear losing his voice the most. That wasn't the deepest wound. What truly frightened him was something far more personal, the moment when singing stopped telling the truth. For most of his life, his voice had been instinctive. He didn't plan emotion, he didn't calculate feeling, he entered it. Pain went in, release came out, and somewhere in between, the world made sense. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that exchange began to fracture, and when it did, Steve felt something unfamiliar rise in its place. Awareness, control, fear. Julie Andrews had reached that place long before him, and she never tried to pretend otherwise. There's a moment singers rarely describe openly, a moment when the voice still works but not freely, when you start thinking about the note before you feel it, when technique replaces surrender, when emotion is measured instead of released. That moment doesn't arrive with drama, it arrives quietly, and once it does, everything changes. Steve reached it without warning, and when he did, he understood something Julie Andrews had lived with every day. A voice can still sound beautiful, and yet feel dishonest to the person inside it. Julie Andrews never explained that. She didn't need to. Her silence explained it better than words ever could. She didn't chase sympathy. She didn't narrate her grief. She simply refused to offer something that no longer felt true. Steve recognized that refusal immediately, because by then, he was standing at the same invisible line. People thought Steve Perry vanished, but he didn't disappear. He withdrew, and there is a difference. Disappearing is avoidance. Withdrawal is mourning. Steve wasn't running from the audience. He was grieving the loss of the one place where he had never felt guarded, where he had never needed armor, where emotion had flowed without permission or restraint. And once that space became fragile, he protected it the only way he knew how, by stepping away. Julie Andrews did the same. She redirected her life not because she wanted to, but because she understood something most people don't. Once the voice becomes a source of anxiety, instead of expression, continuing doesn't heal you, it fractures you further. So she chose discipline over denial, restraint over nostalgia, silence over compromise. Steve Perry understood that choice more deeply than he ever admitted publicly, because for artists like them, performance is not a job, it's an offering. And once that offering feels incomplete, or worse, misleading, it becomes unbearable to give. The criticism didn't matter, the rumors didn't matter, the questions didn't matter. What mattered was waking up each morning knowing the world still expected something he could no longer give honestly. That pressure doesn't motivate artists like Steve, it suffocates them. There were moments when he considered pushing through, moments when returning felt tempting, but every time, the same question stopped him. Am I doing this because it's true, or because it's expected? Julie Andrews had already answered that question for herself, and her answer echoed louder than applause ever could. Years passed, the world adjusted, new voices filled the space he left behind. But Steve never rushed back, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't betray what singing once meant to him. When he finally returned, carefully, selectively, it wasn't an attempt to reclaim the past. It was an acknowledgement of it, a reconciliation, a quiet conversation with the part of himself that had gone silent, and even then, he chose restraint, not excess, not spectacle, truth. That's the part Julie Andrews understood better than almost anyone. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is preservation. It's the space where meaning survives when sound no longer can. Neither of them wanted applause for endurance. Neither of them wanted to be praised for surviving loss. They wanted peace. And peace doesn't require explanation. There's a reason Steve Perry never framed his absence as tragedy, and why Julie Andrews never framed hers as injustice. They didn't want to be remembered as victims of circumstance. They wanted to be remembered as guardians of something sacred. In the end, Steve Perry didn't envy Julie Andrews' silence. He recognized it, because it represented a decision most artists never have the courage to make. To stop. Not when the world grows tired of you, but when your soul asks you to. That's why Steve Perry understood Julie Andrews' silence, not as weakness, not as retreat, but as love. Love for the craft, love for truth, love for the voice that once carried everything, and deserved to be protected, even in quiet. Silence didn't erase their legacy, it preserved it, and sometimes the most powerful sound an artist leaves behind is the one they choose not to make. There's a misconception that silence means emptiness, but for artists like Steve Perry and Julie Andrews, silence was full of memory, full of restraint, full of everything they chose not to cheapen. In quiet moments, Steve understood something most fans never considered. That the voice people loved didn't disappear. It lived on precisely because it wasn't overused, because it wasn't forced into decline, because it was allowed to rest where it belonged, in memory, untouched. Julie Andrews carried the same understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for an audience is let them remember you as you were, not as a version struggling to keep up with the past, not as an echo chasing applause, but as a moment that remains intact. And maybe that's why their silence felt so heavy, because it wasn't empty, it was intentional. Steve Perry didn't stop singing because he stopped loving music. He stopped because he loved it too much to let it fade carelessly. Julie Andrews didn't stop because she lost her courage. She stopped because she knew courage sometimes sounds like restraint. That kind of silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of respect.